Hello, good evening. Sorry for the delay. Had some technical difficulties tonight, and so finally got the internet connection, and here we are. Something that's come up a lot in clinic this week is brain health. Now, it's come up in a few different forms. Some people were concerned about risk for Alzheimer's or stroke, Lou Gehrig's disease or ALS, and other just types of dementias and things that people have been concerned about this week. And so this week's talk, I wanted to give some general principles for how do you keep your noggin healthy. So one of the first things, of course, is lifestyle changes. So there's a few different kinds of things you can do through lifestyle that will really improve the risk, hi Ma, that will really improve your risk factors for getting any kind of brain disease. Generally speaking, the more plants that you eat and the less processed foods, especially those that are rich in saturated fats, it's very good for brain health in general. Of course, one of the things that is most critical for brain health is staying away from certain products such as tobacco products. Especially with the rise these days of cigarettes and cigars and vapes and chewing tobacco. There's all different ways in which people can get tobacco products in their system, and they tend to be very damaging to the blood vessels in general. And so highly encourage anyone who is using tobacco products of any sort not just to get off tobacco for, things like erectile dysfunction and cancer risk and so forth, but also it's very important for improving blood flow to the brain as well. Exercise is one of the most important things you can also do to keep the brain healthy. It's a very simple one. Basically, when you get more blood flowing to the brain, then the brain tends to be healthier in general. Meditation is also another thing that can be very helpful for brain health over time, as well as other forms of mental exercise, concentration, and so forth. There has been a lot of studies on things like when people are doing second languages, or if they're studying crossword puzzles, or taking courses later in life, that their risk for Alzheimer's is lower. For the children that are out there, if you're studying in college and in high school and such, basically they found that the higher level of mathematics that people were able to get also tended to be very protective of the brain as well. For the different forms of exercises, I found a few things in the literature that were helpful. One of these is simply walking. People who walked a mile a day had lower risks of things like Alzheimer's dementia. Also, as far as the other forms of exercise, dancing was one of the ones that seemed to be protective as well. And maybe it's because with the dancing, not only are you getting blood flow to the brain, but you're also engaging more of your senses. There's a social connection. You're usually dancing with other people, moving to the beat, and so it's a very integrative form of exercise, whereas some other forms of exercise did not seem to correlate in the studies anyway of having a better effect on the brain as far as risk for dementia goes. There was another study that showed that people with a Mediterranean diet also had lower risk for Alzheimer's and also a lower mortality for Alzheimer's as well. Now, mortality, of course, means that they succumbed to the disease or they died from it. Generally speaking, though, most of the time I recommend a whole food, plant-based diet with no added oils or simple sugars. And the main thing with that is that there's a few different risk factors for Alzheimer's and other forms of brain diseases that when people have a whole food, plant-based diet as the centerpiece of what they're doing for their lifestyle, it tends to build a very, very good base of a variety of fruits and vegetables and whole grains and many, many foods, which are very protective in general for the brain. Also, there's a genetic component sometimes for certain kinds of brain diseases. For example, Alzheimer's, people with a particular gene allele, basically meaning the gene's called ApoE4. Don't worry about the name, but there's a few different varieties of this particular gene that tend to be more associated with early Alzheimer's risk. And Dr. Greger in nutritionfacts.org covers a very interesting study where they look at people with this particular genetic background, and if somebody has 2 of that gene, they tend to get Alzheimer's and cognitive impairment at a much earlier rate than folks without 2 copies of that gene. And that seemed to be very true in Western world, so where people usually have a diet that's very, very rich in saturated fats and sugars and all sorts of other kinds of lovely junk food that we have in the West. And in rural Africa, where the rate of the gene was the same, they actually found much lower rates of Alzheimer's. And it wasn't because the people were dying off sooner in that part of the world. This is people who are living the same age in both cases. And what they found is that in this part of Africa, the diet pattern or the staples of the diet across the whole country were very different. There was a lot more emphasis on whole plant foods, especially things like yams and greens and all sorts of other root vegetables and other native fruits and vegetables to that area. And they didn't have a lot of processed foods and oils and things historically in this particular area, and so it wasn't as much part of the culture. And very fascinating, because there's a new mechanism for how it's suspected that Alzheimer's may develop, and that has to do with the ability of the brain to clear out some of these saturated fats from it. And that gene in particular is associated with a receptor transporter that works with that as well. So anyway, more details, of course, are going to be on nutritionfacts.org, and I encourage you to check out the articles that Dr. Greger has available on that website, because a lot of good research is on there. He covers diabetes as well as Alzheimer's and many other things in his big long presentation about disabilities as well. And so being that Alzheimer's is one of the most feared disabilities, because let's face it, there's very little that as a culture and a society that we know how to stop it, generally speaking. And it can be very difficult to watch a loved one actually go through those phases of slowly progressing along the course of becoming Alzheimer's, dementia, and so forth. So there's a lot of other kinds of dementia out there. Alzheimer's is kind of a key theme for tonight's talk, just because it's so prevalent. But also remember that when people are having a lot of alcohol, then there's actually a type of early Alzheimer's that can set in. We call it Wernicke's encephalopathy. Big fancy letter for basically when people are having when people are having a lot of alcohol, it has a tendency to cause problems for the brain, and they have Alzheimer's-like symptoms that sets in very early. So if I'm counseling somebody that has a history of alcoholism or that's currently having alcohol, I usually recommend that they have plenty of foods that are rich in B vitamins, or sometimes for somebody who's actually in the thralls of alcoholism, not only recommend getting away from the alcohol, but also supplementing with a B vitamin supplement, and sometimes a few other things like magnesium, depending on what their actual blood levels or risk factors show. But that Wernicke's encephalopathy is one of the reasons why when we're detoxing somebody from alcohol, we always used to call it in medicine the banana bag, and I've got a little fun banana here. And so the banana bag, because the B vitamins are fluorescent yellow, and so when the person's recovering from their alcohol problems, then basically we would give them an IV line and hang up the banana bag full of the B vitamins, because that would help their brain to get the B vitamins back in store. because if somebody is very low in B6, shoot, now I'm blanking out. Talk on brain health, and I think it was thiamine actually. So thiamine. So would also give people a dose of thiamine, sometimes 50 milligrams for a few weeks, few months, or something like that, to basically help boost those levels back up in the brain. So there's a lot of different ways in which we can increase our risk for brain disorders like Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. So tobacco, alcohol, those are definitely two avoidable risk factors. And other things that can be avoidable risk factors are basically sitting on your butt too much or being sedentary. When people are active and getting exercise, all that extra blood flow, not only is it helping with the circulation in the heart, but is helping with the circulation in the brain. And as mentioned before, certain types of exercise seem to be more helpful than others. Basically, there was a nice study that was done where they compared different kinds of plant foods in general as far as the ability to protect against brain disorders like Alzheimer's. And generally speaking, almost every plant that was studied seemed to have a protective effect, even such plants such as white potatoes and mushrooms and so forth. Some of the ones that are especially protective are the cruciferous vegetables, and you'll hear me talk about that a lot in these talks, but cruciferous vegetables are a very important family of vegetables. They include things such as broccoli and cauliflower, collard greens, kale, arugula, but when we talk about cruciferous, usually the main one we're talking about is something like broccoli. So that was found to be protective against brain disorders. Also, some of the yellow vegetables, such as carrots. Well, I guess technically they're more orange than yellow, but those are also very protective. In addition, one of the healthiest things on the planet is berries. And berries were very important for brain health. In fact, people that had diets that are rich in blueberries and strawberries tended to be able to slow their cognitive decline by 2.5 years. Really good, interesting information on that study as well. And the main thing with strawberries, and I've got a little demonstration here I've prepared for today's lecture. Ta-da! So here we've got some strawberries, some collard greens, and some grapes for display here. But the nice thing about strawberries is they contain something called egalic acid. And that acid is being studied a lot as far as its potential health benefits for things such as slowing down the decline of the brain and also protecting against different kinds of cancers as well. And when you actually eat a strawberry, you'll find that there's hundreds of different phytochemicals that are in the fruit that actually are able to get in the circulation and basically reach the brain within even minutes of eating the fruit as well. However, hold the cream with the strawberries, because basically the cream that is in there actually blocks the egalic acid from reaching the brain. So again, this is one of those areas where sometimes when I mention a particular component, occasionally people are saying, oh, well, let me go try to find some egalic acid supplement or something. And I would say, no, you're missing the point in that case, because generally speaking, when people talk about supplements, then basically they does not seem to help as much as the whole food. Case in point, there's a lot of research on turmeric and its ability to help with preventing brain demise. And there was a study on comparing turmeric, the actual spice that you might get from the grocery store, and also comparing it to curcumin, which turmeric is one of those foods that the pharmaceutical industry is studying in great detail right now, because they want to so much to have one little thing that they can pull out of that whole food, and then they can tweak it, and then they can market it, and then they sell it back to us for like 1,000 times the original price of the turmeric, which is very, very cheap right now. It's a very common spice you'd find in the grocery store. It's found in Indian curries, which might also explain why folks in India have a tendency to have lower rates of Alzheimer's than other parts of the world, because, again, as part of the culture, curry and turmeric is very, very much featured in the cuisine of that region. Anywho, so when they actually compared the turmeric versus the extract or the curcumin, they found that the curcumin did not seem to help at all with the risk for brain disorders. However, the original turmeric did. There's a group out in California, University of California in Los Angeles, that has been studying the effect of turmeric and curcumin supplements on the brain and so forth. And it was interesting because they were working to try to create a supplement, again, so they could patent it, where they took a little bit of the curcumin and they wrapped it up in little fatty droplets and they packaged it, and they were saying that that's better able to get up into the brain and work to help remove those plaques that are thought to be part of the progression of this Alzheimer's. And so it's very interesting research, and so I went out and was checking out some of those things that they're marketing. But it does make it a little bit more difficult to evaluate if there's any bias or not in their research, because at the same time as they're doing the research, they're also marketing and patenting a supplement that they happen to be creating as well. And so that's one of the things that, generally speaking, makes it a little bit more difficult to evaluate when some of these things are coming out, as far as the effect of one particular food or another on something as important to our lives as brain health. Because a lot of times when places have a financial motive to go forth, then there's always a chance that their research might be a little bit contaminated, so to say, with that. So again, I rely a lot on Dr. Greger's expertise at nutritionfacts.org and Dr. Barnard's at nutritionmd.org, because basically there's no commercial bias. And so when they've gone through and reviewed the literature so far, they've not found any particularly good evidence, generally speaking, for curcumin as opposed to the original whole turmeric. And again, when you're trying to extract one tiny little component out of a plant, you're missing out on all of the other wonderful phytonutrients that you get from it as well. All right, a few other kinds of things. There were some studies on people who were actually drinking fruit and vegetable juices, and I've got another little demonstration here. This just happens to be a little bit of tart cherry juice that I threw into a glass with some water, so freshly reconstituted. And just showing us an example. Occasionally I'll talk about other things. Most of the time when I've been talking about juices historically, I've tended to recommend staying away from them. And globally speaking, I still, generally speaking, recommend staying away from a lot of the juices, only because they tend to be very high in the sugars, and especially if somebody's having a standard Western lifestyle, then basically they oftentimes have some insulin resistance and their bodies aren't able to handle the sugars. But if you're going to choose between, say, a soda and something like a juice, the juice should win out every time, because at least with something like this, you're getting a lot of phytochemicals and other things that are not listed on the nutrition label. And if you choose the varieties that have, like, for example, just blueberry or things like that, then you're not going to get as much of an overload of the sugars on there. And of course, there's always a benefit to having the actual berries and things like this. So why eat grape juice when you can have a bunch of grapes, and you're going to get all the resveratrol and the other things very freshly packaged in there for you as well. So, anyhow. So, yes, Mishesh asks about nuts. Are they as helpful as perceived? Actually, yes, there's a lot of studies on nuts in general and brain function. Dr. Barnard does have a book called Power Foods for the Brain, and he does a lot of wonderful YouTube presentations on this topic as well. So if you've not seen his presentations or heard of his book, The Power Foods for the Brain book is on Amazon for like a penny or something like that. Very cheap, very accessible usually. And he covers things like walnuts and pecans. I don't remember as much about almond, if that is as good for the brain health as the pecans and the walnuts. But basically any kind of nut tends to be very good for the blood vessels, and that will also be good for some of the micronutrients. Dr. Barnard, in his Nutrition MD website, does talk about the when people are having foods that are rich in vitamin E, and the nuts, generally speaking, are rich in vitamin E, so is things like wheat germ and some of the whole grains. The people that had the highest amount of vitamin E in their diet tended to have lower rates of Alzheimer's. On one of the there's a CME, Continuing Medical Education website with that had a beautiful seminar about brain health a couple years ago. After I finish up, I'll be posting some links on these information afterwards in case anyone wants to check it out. And they did a fascinating study where they looked at vitamin E supplements and found that they were not as protective against things like the dementias as the actual nuts were. And one reason for that might be that, again, when we're trying to create a supplement or extract something from the foods in the first place, you're not necessarily extracting it in the same proportion as with something else. So, for example, vitamin E comes in 4 different flavors, and if you're looking at what the supplements are, they usually have a big spike of just one of those components. Whereas if you have a handful of walnuts or almonds or pecans or any of those nuts, you're going to get a variety of all of them. And yes, absolutely, you're right there, Mitesh. I talked about this a little bit earlier, I think, before you came in. But basically, mental exercise tends to be very protective as well. And so, again, folks that know a second language or that have more degrees or just a very focused study in any particular thing, or that regularly exercise their brains with puzzles and other types of things that are fun, tend to be more protective against for the brain health in general. All right, a few other things that tend to be associated with worsening brain health. I kind of implicated a little bit the Western diet earlier in comparing the rates of Alzheimer's amongst folks that were following the Western diet versus folks that were following a whole food, plant-based, rural diet in, I believe it was Nigeria that they were doing the studies there. And a couple of things in a big study that were associated with worse performance for brain health actually included things like white bread and cakes and pies and cookies. You're welcome. And so basically those things are all found in abundance in our Western diet. And also a few other things that are also associated with worse performance. Basically, the high saturated fat that's found in the diet especially, you might wonder, well, where do I get my saturated fat from? In America, some of the highest sources of saturated fat include dairy products. So that's your milks, your cheeses, your butters, and so forth. The higher rates of saturated fat are also found in chicken, pork, fish, and other kind of animal products in general. Sugar is another thing that can be troublesome for the brain as well. And then another one called aluminum. So this one kind of surprised me. I was not aware until a couple years ago that aluminum is something that's very commonly found in antacids, processed cheese, to certain baking powders, and certain cookware is also very rich in aluminum as well. And there seems to be some research that links aluminum concentration with the risk for brain diseases such as Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementias. And it was really surprising when I learned about it in the baking powder type of thing. There's actually a few types of baking powders out there that do not contain aluminum, and so those would be the ones that I'd particularly recommend using if you're using those on your food. Another thing that actually changed my cooking habits was after I read Dr. Barnard's book on Power Foods to the Brain, I had been using a cast iron pan for a lot of my cooking, thinking, I'm getting more iron and this is going to be great. And if you're living in a country or an area that has like almost no iron and everybody's coming down with iron deficiency, in that case, an iron cookware pan may be helpful for the ladies for not getting anemia. However, the type of iron that is released from the pan is not one that's very well used by the body, and it seems to be also implicated in higher rates of inflammatory disorders and in things like the Alzheimer's. So that was an interesting thing that I hadn't learned before that. There's a few other things that are found in animal products specifically that can cause brain problems. One, for example, is glycotoxins. Those are highly found in chicken. There's some other neurotoxins, harmine, for example, mostly found in chickens and turkeys, that's associated with that essential tremor. And so essential tremor, all of us have to some degree, where basically the hands tremor a little bit, and I'm exaggerating a little bit there just to demonstrate. And it usually comes out when people are feeling fatigued, lack of sleep, lack of food, or if they're under stress, it will tend to come out even more. And in some people, it basically starts to become more permanent, where it's not just under those certain circumstances, but most of the time. Sometimes it can be a tremor of the head, where the head nods, and there's several varieties of this type of tremor. And so, again, it was linked with higher increased amounts of chicken and turkey because, again, thought to be this particular chemical called harmine. Somebody was talking to me about modifying the risk factors for basically Lou Gehrig's paralysis. And there's a neurotoxin called BMAA, which is oftentimes found in seafood. And so there seems to be a link between certain seafoods, and I believe it was also in some of the blue-green algae supplements. It seems to be that it's something that certain algae make as a contaminant, and basically that can get into our food supply mostly through the seafood chain and increases the risks for developing that as well. So we talked about aluminum, we talked about avoiding alcohol, we talked about exercise, the importance of avoiding tobacco, again, very critical for health in general. There's a few other foods and spices that may be also very helpful and protective for the brain. So rejoice all of those that enjoy coffee, because it does reduce the risk of both Alzheimer's as well as Parkinson's. There's really not much evidence for coconut oil. Coconut oil is one of those things that's kind of swept the internet, and a lot of times people come by and say, hey, I'm really healthy, I use coconut oil. And they don't realize that coconut oil, unfortunately, yes, there is some talk about these medium chain fatty acids. However, it also is very rich in saturated fat. And so far the balance of the evidence seems to be that the coconut oil doesn't seem to do as much. There's a few areas in which it's possible, and I only say that with a grain of salt possible, and sometimes in people who are taking certain medications like statins, where the amount of fats and cholesterol is artificially lowered in the body, that there sometimes is something called a statin-related loss of memory and so forth. And anecdotally, here and there, a little bit of the coconut may be helpful for reversing that change, but again, I'm speaking on thin ice there. I don't have a lot of evidence to support that. And basically, my overall view on coconut oil is nix the oil. It's a very processed food, and it does not have enough evidence behind it. But if you want to have a little bit of coconut once in a while, again, whole plant food is usually far better than the processed versions. So there's also some other things about turmeric being, again, very helpful for protecting the brain. And also there was some interesting research done on saffron. Saffron is another beautiful spice. This is something that is found in certain, I believe, Spanish foods. I think they call it, forgive me if I mispronounce it, like polenta. And basically, it's a type of saffron dish with, I believe, rice. And the saffron was actually studied, believe it or not, head-to-head against one of the memory drugs. And it was found to be about equivalent to that drug in its ability to help with cognitive decline as well. So again, not anything that absolutely reverses the Alzheimer's, but there seems to be a lot of promise in using whole foods as well as spices, and there's certain spices that really take the cake, so to say, as far as their amount of research and promise that they've been holding. So go forth and exercise and play your crosswords and other mental games and learn and enjoy. When people are basically having basically good company and good relationships, those also tend to be very protective for brain health. When people are getting depressed, that tends to be, again, a little bit more diminishing for it. So there's all sorts of different kinds of things that I could go over. On the nutritionfacts.org website and the NutritionMD website, there's a lot of good information about different things, and of course cutting edge information that's being released as it's reviewed on there. One other resource I want to introduce you guys to tonight, and this is something I've been mentioning in clinic a lot lately, is this book. Unfortunately, it's going to be backwards on the thing, but it's called The Brain's Way of Healing. It's by Dr. Norman Deutsch, and it's talking about the field of neuroplasticity. That's the idea that the brain can kind of change itself in certain circumstances, and it's a fascinating, lovely book. In all honesty, I have not finished the whole thing yet, but it does give some very interesting insights into things we can do proactively to help with the brain. It's a lovely book to read in conjunction with Dr. Barnard's Power Foods for the Brain book, which I mentioned before. I'll put some links to these references down below in case you want to check them out later. I don't know about the iodized salt that you have on there. And this, again, is one of those things where there's a lot of stuff that's out there on the internet. And one of the reasons why I very closely adhere to referring to Dr. Greger's research and Dr. Barnard's references is because I know that they've gone through quite a bit of vetting by these particular physicians who've got a lot of experience in the field. And this, in particular, this is an area where there's a lot of misinformation, to put it kindly, on there, and a lot of confusion that's out there. But as I've said, the information that I've gotten from these particular resources, I've found again and again to be very, very well vetted, and practically in clinic, things tend to improve when people take advantage of it. Just case in point, I had somebody in the clinic for prediabetes almost exactly a year ago now, and we had gone through some of the whole food plant-based information to help with the prediabetes reversal, which, by the way, diabetes, prediabetes, blood pressure, depression, smoking, obesity, heart disease, those all are not only troublesome to the body, but they also tend to be associated with higher risk for dementia as well. So anyway, she'd done this diet, lifestyle, exercise stuff in order to improve her diabetes, prediabetes risk profile. And when she came back in, she basically said, you know, I had no idea how miserable I was before until I started eating this way. And by eating mostly plants, basically she'd taken away a lot of the toxins and contaminants and other things that are inflammatory in our food supply in America especially. And what usually happens is people feel better, they feel lighter, they feel more energetic when they're eating a diet that's really centered around plants and whole foods and the like as well. Alrighty, so I don't want to keep you guys for forever. I just want to give you a few tips for how to prevent brain health, how to prevent brain diseases, and to encourage brain health as well. So I hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you for joining me tonight, and stay tuned a little bit. I'll have some of those references listed for you down below in the comment section under the tab of resources, so that those who want to check out a little bit more in detail, you can go in there and learn a little bit more. All right, have a good evening. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.